Welcome to Beyond the Next Chapter. As always, I am your host, Whitney Clark, and this is one of the books I've been really looking forward to this year, and it did not disappoint. I'm so excited to talk to Silvia Moreno-Garcia today, who's out with her latest, The Bewitching. She's a New York Times bestselling author who you may know from a number of novels, including Mexican Gothic. Silvia is originally from Baja California, but now lives in Vancouver, Canada, where she is joining us today. So thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about The Bewitching. What can readers expect in your new novel?
So I've distilled it into 3 words. It's suspense, folklore, witchcraft.
I love
There you
it. And it features 3 different timelines and some really strong women who we love books about strong women. Kind of run us through your writing process and what inspired this latest book.
It's heavily inspired by both Mexican folklore surrounding witches and New England folklore of the 17th century surrounding witches. Our vision of witchcraft and witches has changed quite a bit through the centuries, and nowadays it's often seen a bit like a superpower. It even literally appears in superhero universes, in the Marvel universe. In the Marvel universe, it does. And then you have even people who go to witch school, to learn potions and witchcraft and all that sort of stuff. But I wanted to get away from that, from the notion of witchcraft as either a benign hobby or something that makes a person a superhero, and return to the idea of witchcraft being extremely dangerous and real force in the universe, which is what people would have thought 500 years ago in New England or even a century ago in Mexico.
What initially inspired this book?
My great-grandmother's stories about witchcraft in central Mexico, and the tradition of legends in the area about that topic, superimposed with my experience living in New England for a few years and the New England landscape, where I lived in Beverly, which is just basically 1 train stop away or 2 train stops away from Salem. So you get to see a lot of the remnants of colonial culture still all around you. And there was a movie theater, I remember, and modern movie theater, and right behind it there was a parking lot, and right behind the parking lot there was some gravestones from the 1600s that were still there. They had built the movie theater afterwards, kind of like around the perimeter of this area, but if you look carefully, you would see it. I had never paid attention to it, saw it one night, and I was like, oh, all right, there it is. A little bit of history in the shadows.
What is it like visiting Salem? I've never been there, and for our listeners that have never been there but are really into this horror genre, what is it like actually getting to go to a place like Salem?
I took a friend of mine to Salem a few years ago when I was in Boston, and they didn't like it. It was very kind of touristy, commercial, and kitschy. So Salem is probably not the best place to go to, but other towns around that area, you still find some of the architecture of the time, some of things like there was a huge um, manufacturing industry in New England at a certain point with weaving, with textiles. And so you see the factories that are left behind from that time period. Obviously, the history of whaling in the area, fishing, and all that sort of stuff. So that's the more interesting historical bits that you find in New England, rather than Salem is very much I mean, they make money out of it. It's a little bit like what I talked about. That is very much the transformed witchcraft experience, where you're consuming it and it's funny or kitschy. People wear hats with pointy ends, and brooms that you can buy for as souvenirs, that sort of stuff, as opposed to the more disquieting elements of New England, where the landscape can be quite lonesome and quite interesting still in some parts of Massachusetts.
And in the book, they sort of talk about Salem and how it's this, touristy place where you go to buy a witch outfit, as you mentioned, that you could wear on Halloween. What authors have inspired you, and which authors specifically inspired this latest book?
There's a section in the 1930s, which is written in first person, and I normally don't get to do that in novels, but in this case I did because it's somebody narrating what happened in the 1930s and their experience with their friend who goes missing. And that section was supposed to not mimic, but approximate the feeling of Shirley Jackson, who is a very famous writer, and she wrote The Haunting of Hill House. And We Have Always Lived in the Castle, books like that. And I wanted to get a little bit close to her voice without imitating her. So those sections were very fun for that reason.
And in the book, as you just mentioned, you have sort of these three timelines in 1908, in 1930s, and then in 1998. What was your writing process like? Did you write each one, or did you sort of go back and forth between the three as we're reading them in the book?
I normally do a fairly detailed outline before I start writing because I often am dealing with different historical time periods, and so I have to know what's going on more or less at a certain point in time. And so I had the outline already, and I was just going linearly from chapter one to two, three, four, five as the book went on.
Yeah. Which time period did you find the most challenging to research and sort of get yourself there and writing in that time period?
They were all very fun. I think it was not something that I would suffer through. I liked going back to 1998 in a way because I was alive in that time. I was in New England in that time. So that was very much about what I kind of remembered that didn't have to do a ton of research about that. It was more like jogging my memory. What was this experience like being in New England in a small college at the time? 1930s, I did a lot of research about the Great Depression, what college might have been like. So that was fun to get back to that mindset where you have dorm mothers watching over the young women, and you have curfews, that sort of situation. And 1908 was really inspired by my great grandmother and the landscape that she inhabited in that time period.
Mhm. And in the afterword, you do talk about your great grandmother who would tell you stories while growing up in Mexico. Talk a little bit about how your great grandmother had really inspired this book and what you learned from her when you were growing up.
Oh, my great grandmother grew up in central Mexico in the mountains, and she told me a lot of folk tales about that area. And one of the common elements of, I guess, of creatures or supernatural beings that you hear in folk tales are witches. And Mexican witches, they're different depending a little bit regionally about what you're talking about. But in central Mexico, they tend to be creatures that can transform into other shapes, animal shapes. One of the shapes that they transform most commonly into is a bird shape. And it's funny because it's a turkey, which doesn't sound very terrifying. But they can often turn into a turkey. Sometimes they leave a body part behind, so their feet might be left behind. The rest of the body becomes a turkey and flies away into the night. They can also turn into balls of fire, so that's why you explain St. Elmo's fire, anything like that in the night. They roam through the skies flying in that shape. And they drink blood. That's another common element of witches in the Caribbean and Latin America, is that they drink the blood, most often the blood of children, babies especially, although there are some variations in the stories. And I have heard stories of witches that uh, kind of like to consume the blood of their family, or witches that are pacified by the blood of their spouse. So you will hear stories about she was a witch, but she since she was married at night, she would turn and she would drink the blood of her spouse just a little bit, and that would satisfy her. So she didn't have to go roaming the skies that often. I guess there was a blood bank um, next to you. And next to those stories of witches, you also hear stories about how to counter witchcraft. So how do you keep a witch outside of your house? One very common method is a pair of scissors, which you open in the shape of a cross. Some say you put it under the bed. Other people say you put it on top of the crib. And there are a lot of different methods, and some are really kind of funny about how to keep witches away, mustard seeds, things like that, so that they will get distracted, counting them, and then methods for capturing and eliminating witches are also part of the folk tales. So I heard a lot of those stories, and they're just, part and parcel of what people used to tell you, just as I might tell you that I went to the supermarket last week and I bought some vegetables. People would tell you about the time they encountered a witch, or what they did to get rid of a witch.
Did you grow up being afraid of witches or more curious and interested about witchcraft?
By the time I heard these stories, it's because this was my great grandmother. I mean, I was a child growing up in modern Mexico in the 1980s, so it didn't scare me. It was a different time period, and a lot of these stories are no longer told. They're kind of like old fashioned. So I was very lucky to listen to them. So I wasn't scared about the stories. I just found them really kind of interesting.
Yeah. What do you hope readers take away from this book when they hear about some of these stories and some of the things that you heard from your own great grandmother?
I think one of the cultural perceptions of witches is that there is just one type of witch. I think because, like I said, in pop culture, we kind of get maybe two archetypes of witches. But nowadays, the most popular one is the witch that is super powered, and we've got a musical that has a witch in a main role, that Wicked, that
Oh
did
yeah.
very well recently. We've got Marvel. With Agatha as a character, and that seems to be the really common representation of the witch that we see. And I wanted to do something that harkens back to older stories, and to also offer, along with some stuff that is inspired by New England folklore, to offer readers a glimpse at what witches are like in Mexico and Latin American culture, which do differ from, I think, the experience of New England. I don't think witches in New England turn into turkeys, for example.
No, when I think of those type, I think of like the movie Hocus Pocus, and that's sort of like the pop culture type of witch. You know what I mean? That I think so many people think of when they think of witches, and of course, Wicked, obviously, which is having its moment this year. You have again three different timelines. You have these three really strong female characters. Minerva is the one set in 1998. Do you have one that you see yourself in the most?
I normally don't see myself in characters, but the 1998 timeline, because I lived in New England, I was going back to a lot of what the landscape looked like for me. And I wanted to reproduce uh, not so much my experiences, but what it feels really like to be a student, a grad student in general. I think sometimes with what people like to call dark academia, it feels very kind of fantasy-ish. I don't know how to express it. Again, very removed from kind of reality, idealized
Hmm.
uh, sort of sort of space, the scholarly space, and that scholarly grad space can be extremely stressful. And my friends who have gone on to do PhDs and postdocs and that sort of situation, it's their kind of their lived experiences never match that kind of vibe. It was kind of like a vibe that I often see mine for the aesthetics of it, but not so much some of the other aspects of it. So I really did want to have a character who is trying to complete a thesis, and you can feel some of the stress and nervousness and all these other factors that are coming into somebody, if you've ever known somebody who has gone to grad school, or if you've gone to grad school yourself, there's a point in which everybody's like, I'm doing my thesis, I can't talk, I need to finish, I need to get my advisor to look at this, I need to go through my bibliography again. And so that kinetic energy, I wanted it to be reflected in that portion of the book in 1998. And then it feels very different, 1998, from when we go to 1908 and we're in Mexico and it's the countryside and we're in the mountains, and there's a young woman there whose family is facing a series of tragedies, and she begins to think that there might be witchcraft, and that is supposed to feel very different from when we were in New England in 1998.
Mhm. And it does feel very different. I feel like it often gets romanticized, the experience of maybe being in grad school. And, she also has an additional responsibility. She's I guess you would say like an RA, correct? And she's sort of caught between being friends with certain people and a specific person whose aunt she's using to look at some old diaries from someone she's looking into in a story she's looking into, kind of caught between this place of like wanting to be sort of cool with people, but then also having to give people citations and whatnot if they're not sort of following the rules. What was your college experience like?
Well, I was an RA in college, and I also worked several jobs on campus. So it was in that sense similar to the character, in the sense that you are working a lot of hours, both academically, and then you're also working to make your tuition, and the RA um, job was good because it allowed me to pay for my housing that way. Um, but it was like doing rounds, and this book takes place in the summer in 1998. In the 1930s during the winter, but in 1998 during the summer. And I didn't do any summer work, but I knew that the campus shuts down, right? There's a day in which everybody kind of leaves, and it was just really funny seeing that happen, how it empties in all these places that are full of people and life in the last couple of days when everybody's leaving and everybody's kind of closing down, how they become dead, and it's a completely different vibe. And so I didn't work in those summers when the campus was completely closed. But I did go back for my 20-year reunion a few years ago, and it was in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
We stayed at what had been a dorm. It wasn't my dorm, but it was one of the one of the dorms, and it's a little bit eerie. There's nobody around, and then we went to poke at the dorm where I had worked, which was being renovated at the time, so we could see like the tarps where the workers were going to come back and paint. But inside there wasn't anything. You could look through the windows and kind of see, but there was nothing inside. It was all empty, and that's weird because you don't remember it that way. You remember it as having, lots of people and the RA's apartment and all the students, and it's completely empty and ghostly. And it was raining in that summer, actually, so it was even worse because it was sort of cold. Um, and and so I got to experience a little bit of what the campus is like when it's shut down. And it's weird. I mean, there were still people there in our case because we were all there for our reunion. So we all got to do some events together, but you could see how at nights it would have been a very different experience than when I was working and doing rounds. And yeah, and in the winter, that was the worst part of being an RA, is I had to do rounds, and we had to go out with our flashlight, and just every hour you were back inside, it was warm, and then you had to go out and it was cold and walk the perimeter. And so it was not fun at all in the winter.
Yeah. Did you ever get used to the cold in this? And was there a lot of snow in the winter? I live in Arizona, so snow is like a completely foreign idea to us.
There was a lot of snow in the winter, yeah. Although, climate change, it's changed. I went to Boston in February again a few years ago, and there was no snow on the ground. And I told them, "Oh, what happened? Did it go away so fast?" And they were like, "It hasn't snowed yet." And I was
Wow.
like, "No, you gotta be kidding, because I remember November, kind of end of November, the flakes started to fall, and December it would be pretty cold. And there was one year where it kind of snowed a little bit in April. It was my birthday in April, and for my birthday there a few flakes fell. So sometimes the winter could be pretty long in New England and pretty chilly. And for people to tell me now, it's
Wow.
like it's not snowing like it used to, I was like, wow, this this looked different. So now I guess I don't know what it's gonna be like in a few years.
Yeah. And you're going to be going to Boston as part of your book tour. And you mentioned this is your first time you're doing a tour like this. Where will you also be stopping?
I'm gonna be stopping in Connecticut, New York, going over to Florida, going over to Texas, and then finalizing in LA.
Okay. What are you looking forward to most about that experience?
It's pretty hectic. I have to be in one day in one place and then one day at another one. So I just hope I don't miss a connection or something like that.
And it's going to be July, obviously. And so definitely no snow in Boston. What did you like about living there when you did spend your years there in college?
There's a park where they have these swan boats, and that's probably my favorite part of Boston is not even going on the swan boats, just watching them go by. They're pretty fun. The whole architecture of New England is really nice. I like brick. So you get to see brick in Boston and old buildings. That's fun. Living in Vancouver, everything's a lot newer because obviously it was settled by the British settlers that started building up the city as we know it nowadays pretty late in the day compared to New England. So we don't have if when we say an old building here, we mean like 1900. And there's very few of them. And when you say an old building in New England, you probably mean like 1600 and something. And same thing in Mexico. When you say an old cathedral, it's probably back to the 17th century. So there's a difference between old and kind of like old, not so like when people here say, oh, it's an old house and it's from the 1970s. I'm like, well, that's just a couple of years older than me.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's sort of like how it is in Phoenix. It's like the oldest building is from like the 1920s, which is nothing in comparison to some of those other parts of the US and other parts of the country. So I understand that Bewitching also comes with a playlist that I saw on your website. How were those songs chosen and why was that important for you to include?
The music is heavily 1990s alternative music from the time period. I just uh, happen to like that era of music, and since I had a timeline in 1998, I said, well, I'll do this. But the other thing is that in the 1990s, what were more popular, the most popular acts of the time were pop. And so you're talking about things like Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. That's the kind of sound that most of us, when you ask somebody what did the 1990s sound like, that's probably what most people would respond, oh, that. And that is true that was extremely popular. But I really wanted to do alternative kind of music that was maybe not that popular, but was interesting nevertheless. And I thought the sounds that I was looking for, the vibe that I was looking for, it was really suited to that kind of music of that era, as opposed to NSYNC. No offense.
That's okay. No offense taken. And music is really important to one of the characters, Minerva. How is music part of her life and her character's life in the book?
She's always listening to music. In this time period, you're talking about CDs and CD and Discmans, not listening to your phone. I think this is a character that again is a scholar and so is very busy working in a thesis, and that involves a lot of alone work. It's you with a lot of books and a computer and maybe a visit to the library, but it's very solitary work, and so that reflects both uh, the chosen career path of the character, but just also the personality of the character. This is somebody that wants to be kind of by themselves. And so the choice of having headphones all of the time and being kind of inaccessible, I think is something that reflects the personality of this character. And so I was able to also mention a lot of good music by doing that. I like characters who have their small private obsessions, and they're often surrounding some type of art. So whether it's um, alternative rock or opera or some type of cinema, things like that. I like characters who have that inside of them.
Mhm. What would you say your sort of obsessions like that are as well?
Well, they're often on the page. They're movies. I'm a big movie fan. I've watched movies since I was a small child. Um, Different types of books, of subgenres of books, music too. I was very much into music, and that's at one point in time. Not so much anymore, but there was a point in time when I was pretty much scouring all the bins of stores that sold CDs at the time to find new bands and new sounds and new things um, like that. I don't like TV, that's the truth, but I do like opera and weird facts, mushrooms, all that kind of stuff.
When did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
I was writing since I was a teenager, but my serious kind of adult writing, when my voice begins to emerge, it was when I was in my mid-20s and I had moved to Canada.
What was it like for you to write your first book compared to sort of where you are now with The Bewitching in your latest book?
My debut novel was Signal to Noise. It was not the first book that I wrote, but it was the first book that got sold and was published. Signal to Noise is a lot about music in Mexico City, and it is a bit of a coming of age story, both in middle age and in teenagehood, which sometimes people think that we, I think, become mature. You turn 18 and you're an adult, you're mature, and I know plenty of immature 30 somethings. So it's a little bit about that, about finding yourself again, or finding yourself maybe for the first time when you're in your 30s. And there's an element of magic. It was very much didn't really fit into categories kind of novel, and but it got published anyway by somebody that published fantasy and science fiction, which was odd, but they liked it. Um, yeah, I guess I didn't really have very many expectations about that book. Nobody did at the time when it came out. It was an oddity. And now, as the years have come by, there's a series of expectations and ideas that become attached to you as your career grows, and um, some good, some bad expectations. And one of them is, my most famous book is Mexican Gothic. So people often ask, is this like Mexican Gothic or not? And because I've switched genres so much, I've gone from one thing to the other. I often have to say, no, it's nothing like it, which leaves people disappointed. But in this case, I do think The Bewitching, because it's horror, um, because it has a lot of elements of suspense, because of a number of factors, it is probably closer to the Mexican Gothic experience than some of my other works. So maybe some people will feel happy about that.
And the horror genre is one where the horror fans are extremely dedicated. I mean, there's people that will only read horror books. What was it like for you to write a book in that particular genre? What's so special about that genre for you?
I read horror since I was a kid. Since I was like 11, I started reading horror, and I wrote a lot of horror stories before I sold my first novel. I've probably published more than, I think it's 80 stories by now, short stories. The bulk of them were written and published before I had a novel out. I was really dedicated to the short story form. And I got to be in all kinds of very, very small anthologies and very, very small online magazines, very niche things. It was very fun. So um, one of my favorites was there was erotic Cthulhu anthology called Cthulhu Erotica, and I'm in that. And things like that. I'm in a queering Poe anthology with a lesbian version of the Gaia. I was in all sorts of things, and part of the delight of that epoch was that there were a lot of markets online. It was a big explosion of online zines and horror zines, and just being able to jump from one thing to the other, from one story to the other very quickly. And I would look at the calls for anthologies, the calls for magazines, and if it was something that attracted my attention, I would be like, I'm in it. I'm going to write something for it. Zombie dogs. All right, I'm on it, kind of situation. So that was very fun.
What was your favorite part of writing The Bewitching?
I think my favorite section was probably in the 1930s because I was able to do first person and try my hand at the Shirley Jackson vibe part of the novel. But I also just loved going and reading a lot of folk tales, New England folk tales. I knew um, about the witch trials and several of these conflicts that happen when somebody accuses another person. When you actually read the transcripts, when you actually read kind of like how the jury is interrogating somebody, it gets pretty kooky. There's some really bizarre stuff, as you can imagine, when you're accusing somebody of witchcraft and you're saying, well, what evidence do you have? And um, it's things like, well, I saw this person and they had a bird in their hands and the bird was drinking blood from their chest, and so it was obviously their familiar, things like that. So that was really interesting, putting yourself in that mindset in which this is serious business, because we're actually having a process to go through that, and how somebody sometimes is found guilty but sometimes not, how sometimes they determine, no, this person did not commit witchcraft, they're just annoying or something,
Yeah.
something like that, and returning to my great grandmother's folk tales and remembering that was also very fun.
Yeah. Are there any other books you would recommend for readers if they read The Bewitching, now they really enjoyed it and they want to read more sort of about what you touched on? Are there any books you read in your research that you would recommend as well?
Um, Not from my research, but I was also thinking about Peter Straub and Ghost Story, which is set in New England, and it's probably his most famous book, and it's a very chunky book. I think it has a sense of something supernatural and menacing and ancient that must be taken seriously. So it's not uh, kind of I guess, the horror that you can laugh at or that you can take not so seriously. There's something that feels very kind of nasty about the situation that these characters are involved in Ghost Story. And I think I was remembering some of that vibe. And again, I was not trying to write like Peter Straub exactly, but it was some of the feelings that it evoked of unease, and especially of unease related to a particular landscape.
Yeah. Okay, great. Is there anything else you want to add about The Bewitching that I haven't asked that you would like readers to know?
Oh, yeah, there's no actual spells are used in the Bewitching, that you can copy and attempt to use at home, although there are very much inspired by some spells that I either know or heard about doing folkloric research. And my favorite way to combat witches, or which is a traditional way to do it in Mexico, is that you have to tie knots. So you tie knots, and then you say a religious prayer, basically, as you're tying the knots, and that witch's knot will allow you to basically, I guess, subdue the witch.
Oh,
Uh, but but the most practical method of dealing with a witch, which is what I heard from my great grandmother, is that you simply, you wait at night, you've got a big bag like a big cloth bag. And then when you see something strange, maybe a turkey that doesn't look quite turkey-ish, you just throw it on top of it. And then you basically grab a big stick and you just beat it up, beat the hell out of it. That's how you deal with witches. And it does come up in folklore actually as a very common way to deal with a witch is like give it a good beating when they're in their animal shape. And then when they return to their human shape, they're not going to do it again. They're not going to go and like try to eat you at night or eat your cattle or things like that. But yeah, so if you are ever having any kind of problems or you think you're feeling bewitched, just stay up at night, have a really big bed sheet or something, and be ready to, in a coyote acme kind of situation, just toss it over and just give it a good beating, and they'll learn their lesson.
Hey, we're not going to forget that. That's a tip and a half.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this book, and I know readers will as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the release and visiting readers throughout the country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.